After giving birth to twin girls, a settler woman faced death at her in-laws' hands until a lonely widower stepped in. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and by nightfall, the land had turned to something more mud than earth, the sky stitched shut by thick clouds that refused to move. Inside the Howell house, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood, old anger, and something else, blood. Marin's body trembled with each contraction, her legs numb and shaking beneath her as she gritted her teeth against the pain. No one had come when she first called for help. It had been the midwife, Alma, a woman half-blind with age and weighed down by silence, who arrived after hearing Marin's cries drifting across the plains. She'd come with no lantern, no supplies, just instinct and worn hands that knew death often came quieter than life. When the first child slid free into Alma's arms, a sharp, tiny cry filled the room. Then, seconds later, another. The sound of 2 newborn girls wailing in the dark broke something open in Marin. Relief, terror, wonder, all at once. But Alma didn't smile. Her face darkened when she whispered, "Twins. Girls." Her eyes flicked toward the door as if she knew already what that would mean. Marin reached out with shaking arms, gathering the warm, squirming bodies against her chest. She didn't even have to ask what would come next. She'd known long before the pain started. The Howells didn't want girls. They wanted heirs, boys, shoulders broad enough to plow the land, arms strong enough to carry on the Howell name. Girls were burdens. And 3 daughters later, Marin was no longer a wife. They saw her now only as a failed investment. Footsteps sounded down the hallway. The door opened without a knock. Mrs. Howell entered, dressed in black though her son had been dead nearly a month. Her lips pressed into a line, her eyes like stones. Behind her came Nathan, the younger Howell brother. His face, thin and sharp, barely twitched when he saw the babies. He just nodded once. "Girls?" he asked. Alma answered with a single nod. Silence followed. Then, coldly, Mrs. Howell said, "We'll make arrangements." Marin watched them go. Her arms tightened around the twins. Alma moved quietly, cleaning what she could. When she turned, her expression was not just tired, it was afraid. "They won't wait long," she whispered. "I've seen this before. You don't bleed out fast enough, they'll help you along." Marin didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her fingers curled protectively around her daughter's swaddled bodies. She knew it too. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake in the dark, listening. Rain slapped against the windows like fingers trying to get in. Wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but it was the voices in the barn that chilled her blood. She couldn't make out every word, but enough carried across the soaked land to twist her stomach into knots. Still bleeding. Say she passed in the night. Won't raise girls in this house. Her breath caught. Alma was already gone. The door to her room bolted. No one would come again. With the last of her strength, Marin rose. She wrapped her daughters tight, tucking them into a thick wool blanket she'd hidden beneath the bed for months. Ever since the second daughter had died hours after birth, and Mrs. Howell hadn't let her bury the child herself. That night had changed something in Marin. She had begun preparing, quietly, secretly, as if some part of her had already known this night would come. She kissed her daughters' foreheads and whispered their names into the shadows, Wren and Lark. And then, barefoot and bleeding, she stepped out into the storm. Mud clung to her feet like fingers trying to pull her down. The wind tore at her hair. She didn't look back. Behind her, a flicker of orange glowed against the night. Smoke followed. She didn't need to guess. They'd set the shed alight, hoping the fire would do what they hadn't dared yet. She'd slept there often when the house had felt too suffocating, too dangerous. If she'd been there tonight, they'd have found her bones in the ash by morning. Her teeth chattered. The pain hadn't stopped. Her legs buckled once, then again. But she didn't fall. She couldn't. Every step forward was a fight, her vision swimming, her arms aching with the weight of the twins. Somewhere in the darkness, a shape emerged. A horse. A rider. For a second, she thought it was Nathan, that he'd followed her to finish what they started. She froze, breath caught in her throat, legs locked. But the horse slowed, and the man dismounted. He didn't speak. He didn't draw a weapon. Just moved slowly, like someone who had learned not to startle wild things. When he stepped into the moonlight, she saw a face worn by years in silence. A beard touched with gray. Eyes tired, but alert. He looked at her, at the children, at the blood on her dress, and the fear written across her skin. He didn't ask questions. He held out a hand, not to touch, just to offer balance if she needed it. Marin wanted to collapse, to let the dark take her. But she didn't. She stood taller. The man gestured toward his horse, then turned and walked. She followed. The cabin stood at the edge of a thick line of trees, tucked low into the hills like a secret. Smoke drifted from the chimney. When he opened the door, heat poured out. Firelight danced across the walls. He stepped aside, letting her enter first. Inside, everything smelled of pine and ash. There was no sound but the crackle of the fire and the twins' small breaths. She sank onto a cot. The man moved slowly, without speaking. He brought her water, clean cloths, something warm to wrap around the babies. Then he sat by the hearth and watched the flames, letting silence settle like snow. Maren stared at the cradle tucked into the corner. Empty but well-made, dusty from disuse. Her body ached. Her mind spun. But she was not dead. Her daughters were alive. For now. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't speak at all. Neither did he. There would be time for that, if the morning came and the Howells hadn't already started hunting. Outside, the storm began to break. But inside the cabin, something fragile had started to form. Not safety. Not yet. But the first faint breath of it. The next morning, the cabin was wrapped in frost, the ground outside gleaming under a pale sky. Maren woke to the quiet sounds of a man tending the fire. Her body ached with a deep, bruised kind of pain, but she was warm. The twins stirred beside her, their faces soft and pink against the worn quilt. The man she'd followed through the storm sat in a chair by the hearth, carving a piece of wood with a steady hand. He hadn't said a word the night before. He still didn't. But when he noticed her eyes were open, he nodded once. Not as a greeting, but as confirmation. She was alive. He stood and walked toward the stove. A moment later, he placed a mug of something warm near her and returned to his chair. The quiet didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned. Days passed, then a week. He moved around the cabin with the silence of someone who'd lived too long alone and forgotten the use of noise. Maren didn't press him. She didn't ask for his story, and he didn't ask for hers. But bit by bit, they learned each other in the rhythms of shared space. He chopped wood without needing to be asked. She swept the floor even when her legs still trembled. He left food out without comment. She washed what she used. The twins grew stronger. Their cries became sharper, their eyes more curious. He built a cradle from rough wood and lined it with a wool blanket. When Maren saw it, she felt something break loose in her chest, not grief this time, but something smaller and stranger. Something like the edge of hope. One afternoon, she finally spoke. She told him her name. He nodded and told her his, Elias. A man once married, now widowed for 3 years. No children. No family left. Just this cabin and the quiet. Maren said nothing for a while. Then she told him just enough for him to understand that going back was not an option. That the Howells wouldn't stop looking. That the barn wasn't an accident. Elias didn't ask for more. He just looked toward the door and muttered that the trail near the West Ridge had wagon tracks on it yesterday that weren't there the day before. That night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the creaks of the wood. She thought she was safe. She'd let herself believe it. But the Howells were patient. They had land, influence, and no shortage of bitter ambition. Losing their son had not softened them. It had only sharpened their reasons to control everything he left behind, including Maren and her children. The next morning, Elias handed her a rifle. It was old, but well kept. He showed her how to hold it, how to aim without shaking. He didn't ask if she'd shot before. She hadn't. But she learned quickly. Fear made her focus. By the end of the 3rd day, she was hitting empty cans he'd lined up on the fence post. Her shoulder ached, but her back stayed straight. You don't need to be perfect, he said, finally breaking the silence. You just need to be heard. Spring crept in slow, thawing the edges of the land. Snow became mud, then soil. Tiny green shoots broke through the ground, defiant. The cabin filled with sound, baby laughter, kettle whistles, floorboards groaning with new footsteps. But the quiet wasn't peace. Not yet. It was the eye of something turning. One morning, while Elias was in the woods checking his traps, Maren spotted a man standing on the ridge. Too far to make out a face, but close enough to see that he watched the cabin without moving. She didn't go outside. She stood in the doorway with the rifle in her arms until the shape turned and walked away. When Elias returned, she didn't need to explain. He just nodded and began reinforcing the windows. That night, they buried supplies in 2 spots, just in case they needed to leave fast. Elias didn't say where they'd go, only that the map under the floorboards had a trail marked in charcoal. The twins slept through the night for the first time, but Maren didn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shadows outside the window. The next visit wasn't distant. It came in the form of two riders, deputies from Harrow Creek. They arrived at noon, just as the sun cut through the trees. Marin recognized the brand on one of the horses. Howell Property. The men knocked once, then stepped back. Elias answered the door. Marin stood behind him, the twins in her arms, heart pounding against their tiny backs. One of the deputies, older with a crooked nose, tipped his hat. "We're looking for a woman named Marin Howell. Accused of theft, disappearance, and arson. Got 2 infants with her. Heard she was headed west." Elias didn't flinch. "Ain't no one like that here," he said. "Just me and my land." The deputies looked past him. One tried to lean in. "Mind if we look around?" Elias didn't move. "I do mind." The second man, younger and mean-eyed, clicked his tongue. "Might be we come back with a warrant." Elias stepped out fully onto the porch. "Then come back with one. Until then, ride on." Something in his voice didn't invite argument. After a long pause, they did ride on. But slowly. Watching. Memorizing. That night, Marin packed the girls' clothes into a satchel without being told. Elias didn't stop her. He just added jerky, dried apples, and a flask of water. But in the morning, the riders didn't return. A day passed. Then another. Then 3. The quiet stretched again. Elias walked the perimeter more often. Marin kept her rifle closer. The girls began to crawl. They laughed more, pulled at the blankets, filled the cabin with life. But the air still buzzed with something unfinished. The letter came 2 weeks later, brought by a quiet boy on a mule who didn't know what he was carrying. A summons. A court date. A name signed at the bottom that made Marin's stomach churn, Mrs. Howell. Claiming custody. Claiming ownership. Claiming rights. Marin's hands shook as she read. Elias stood behind her, jaw set. She looked up at him. "If I don't go, they'll say I'm hiding." "Guilty." He nodded slowly. "Then we go together." She wanted to argue, to tell him not to get involved. But she didn't. Because the truth was, she didn't want to face it alone. They spent 2 days preparing. Marin sewed new dresses from spare cloth. Elias cut his hair with a hunting knife. They loaded the wagon at dawn and set out east, the twins bundled between them, their eyes wide and unknowing. The road stretched long and silent, but every turn brought them closer to the reckoning Marin had avoided for too long. She didn't know how it would end. She only knew this time she wouldn't walk in alone. The town of Harrow Creek rose from the plains like a bruise, dark, tight, and waiting to burst. As Marin and Elias arrived, the dust from the road clung to their clothes and the wagon creaked with every turn of its wheels. The girls sat between them in a basket, blinking up at the foreign noise of a place filled with whispers. People stared. Not openly, but with the tight, flicked glances of those trained in small-town suspicion. The Howells' name still carried weight, and Marin knew that to many here, her guilt was already written before a word had been spoken. Still, she didn't bow her head. She didn't flinch. The hearing was set in the old church, its steeple rising high above the town as if God himself might be called as witness. Inside, pews creaked under the weight of bodies packed close. At the front sat Judge Templar, a woman older than the town itself, with a face weathered like dry bark and eyes that missed nothing. The Howells sat stiffly in the front row, Mrs. Howell dressed in widow's black, though her mourning had always been more for her legacy than her son. Beside her sat Nathan, his face drawn tight, his hands resting too still. Marin held her daughters close as her name was called. She rose without hesitation. Each step forward echoed through the church like a drum. The silence that met her was not warm, not trusting, but it was listening. That was enough. She spoke plainly, beginning with the night of the birth. She told them of the blood, the silence, the whispers in the barn. She told them how Alma the midwife had been dismissed the moment the babies were born. She described the fire that would have swallowed her, the rain that hid her escape, the hand that helped her when she could no longer walk. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke like someone laying bricks, carefully, one at a time, until the shape of the truth stood tall and clear behind her. The Howells' rebuttal was as cruel as it was hollow. Mrs. Howell spoke of theft, of betrayal, of hysterical behavior. Nathan claimed he found the barn already aflame. They painted Marin as unfit, unstable, ungrateful. For a moment, the crowd leaned their way, as if a well-pressed dress and a polished lie could outweigh a woman's word. Then, the door creaked open. Alma stepped inside, her gray hair pulled back, her clothes simple but clean. The room turned as one. Her steps were slow but certain. She reached the front without invitation and faced the judge. "I was there," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "I saw the babies. I heard the whispers. I saw what they meant to do." The silence cracked. Alma's testimony was brief, but it hit like a storm rolling in from nowhere. She spoke not just of the night, but of the years before, the cold meals, the bruises, the isolation. She named what the Howells refused to. Maren hadn't fled. She had survived. When she finished, the judge sat back, folded her hands, and let the weight of it settle. "This court finds no basis for the charges against Maren Howell," she said. "The matter is closed. She is free under law to choose her path." The Howells stood without a word. Nathan's face was stone. Mrs. Howell's eyes locked with Maren's, and in them was something sharp, something that hadn't given up the fight. But Maren didn't look away. She held her gaze until the older woman turned and left. Outside, the sky had cleared. The crowd dispersed in slow murmurs, but Maren barely heard them. Elias stood waiting beside the wagon. When she stepped down from the church steps, she didn't speak. She just walked into his arms, her daughters between them, and let herself exhale for the first time in weeks. They didn't return to the cabin right away. Elias had brought her here once before, but now she led the way back. They stopped at the ridge just before the tree line. She turned to look at the town once more, small, hunched, already disappearing into the dust. "I'm not going to let them shape me anymore," she said, voice low. Elias didn't answer, just took her hand and followed. Back at the cabin, the air was quiet and clean. The trees whispered in the wind, the earth soft with spring. Elias planted early vegetables, and Maren began sewing new dresses from what cloth remained. The girls began to crawl faster, their laughter filling the room. There were no fences around the land, no locks on the doors. But safety wasn't built with wood or nails. It was built in glances, in silence that didn't hurt, in the way Elias would stop whatever he was doing if one of the girls cried, or how Maren would hum while she cooked songs she'd thought forgotten. One night, long after the court, Elias placed something small in Maren's hand. A ring carved from birch. No stones, no gold, just smooth, honest wood. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She nodded, and they sat together under the stars while the fire in the hearth crackled behind them. Not as lovers rushed by need, but as survivors joined by choice. Summer warmed the land. The twins took their first steps near the creek. A neighbor from the East Ridge passed by once and asked Maren if she'd ever think of going back to Harrow Creek. "To visit?" she asked. Then she smiled. "No, the future's not behind me." She wrote letters now, sometimes to herself, sometimes to a daughter in the future who might one day need to know that strength wasn't born from comfort. She kept one letter folded in the drawer beside the crib. It said, in simple handwriting, "I lived. I chose. I fought. And I made something that stayed." That fall, they planted an apple tree behind the cabin, the same spot where Elias had once buried a ring for a wife long gone. Maren pressed her fingers into the soil beside his and whispered a wish she didn't speak aloud. Above them, the sky turned gold, and the wind carried the sound of something beginning again. Not with thunder, but with breath. And this time, no one could take it from her.